The excavator stopped for exactly 3 seconds. That was the moment I realized the contractor understood something nobody else on that construction site had bothered to ask. He looked down from the cab of the machine toward me standing beside my old pickup truck. Then he looked back at Melissa Bradford. "Are you sure we should continue?" he asked. Melissa did not hesitate. She adjusted the sleeve of her white blazer, glanced at the group of homeowners watching from the roadside, and gave a small, confident smile. "Keep going." That single sentence would eventually cost Silver Creek Estates more than anyone imagined. But that morning, nobody believed they were making a mistake. They believed they were creating progress. The hydraulic arm lowered again. The metal bucket pressed against the old wooden railing. For a second, nothing happened. Then the first beam cracked. The sound echoed across the creek valley. It was not just the sound of wood breaking. It was the sound of 66 years of history disappearing in a few seconds. I stood there watching another support beam collapse into the shallow water below. The morning air smelled like fresh-cut pine, wet soil, and diesel fuel. Birds scattered from the cottonwood trees along the creek bank as the machine continued tearing apart the bridge my grandfather built before Silver Creek Estates even existed. Melissa Bradford stood beside the excavator holding a clipboard. She looked completely comfortable, almost proud. She was the president of the Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association, and she had spent months convincing everyone that this moment represented a new beginning for the neighborhood. A modern entrance, a more beautiful community, a better future. She never looked at the bridge. She looked at the people watching. She wanted them to remember this as her achievement. Several homeowners were recording the demolition on their phones. Someone behind me said the new entrance would finally make Silver Creek Estates look like the luxury community it was supposed to be. Another person said the old bridge had been an outdated structure that should have been replaced years ago. They were not cruel people. They simply believed the story Melissa had told them. And that story was simple. The bridge was old. The bridge was ugly. The HOA had authority. The problem was that only one of those statements was actually true. The bridge was old. Everything else was an assumption. I reached into my jacket pocket and turned on my phone camera. I was not recording because I thought I could stop what was happening. By that point, I had already tried. I had contacted the county. I had spoken with officials. I had explained that the bridge was private property and that the HOA did not have permission to remove it. But construction equipment moves faster than government paperwork. And Melissa knew that. She believed speed was on her side. What she did not know was that documentation was on mine. My name is Nathan Cole. I am 42 years old. I am a civil engineer specializing in bridge restoration. For nearly 20 years, I have inspected, repaired, and restored structures throughout Kentucky and Tennessee. I know how bridges fail. I know how they survive. And more importantly, I know the difference between something that simply looks old and something that still carries value. That bridge was never just wood and steel. It was the reason my family remained connected to that land for 3 generations. My grandfather built it. My father maintained it. And I had inspected every section of it every year since taking responsibility for the property. Melissa Bradford believed she was removing an outdated obstacle. She had no idea she was removing the one thing protecting her entire neighborhood from a legal problem she never knew existed. By the time the final beam fell into the creek, she believed she had won. She believed she had erased the past. What she actually did was create a record of the biggest mistake Silver Creek Estates had ever made. I was born 20 miles from that creek, and for as long as I can remember, that bridge was part of every important memory in my life. When I was a child, my grandfather Walter Cole would wake me before sunrise during spring inspections. He would hand me an old toolbox that had belonged to him for decades and tell me to bring the flashlight. Back then, I did not understand why a bridge needed so much attention. I thought wood was wood. Bolts were bolts. And if something was still standing, it was probably fine. My grandfather taught me otherwise. He would place his hand against the railing and listen. Not literally. He would listen for changes. A loose connection. A movement that should not be there. A sound that told an experienced person something had changed. Structures always tell you the truth, he used to say. You just have to know how to listen. Those words stayed with me. They were part of the reason I became a civil engineer. Most people see bridges as simple objects. They see concrete, steel, wood, measurements. But engineers see something different. We see decisions. Every support beam represents a choice. Every foundation represents planning. Every repair represents someone caring enough to protect what already exists. My grandfather understood that better than anyone. When he bought that property in 1958, most people thought he was making a mistake. The land was beautiful, but the creek divided it almost perfectly in half. During heavy rain, crossing became dangerous. There was no nearby access route, no convenient road, no developer interested in solving the problem. So my grandfather did what people of his generation often did. He solved it himself. He worked with county officials. He followed the required process. He spent 2 summers building the timber bridge with neighbors who exchanged weekends of labor instead of money. When it was finished, nobody celebrated with a ribbon ceremony. There were no newspaper articles, no official photographs. It simply became part of everyday life. That was the point. Good infrastructure is often invisible. People notice it only when it disappears. My father continued maintaining the bridge after my grandfather passed away. He replaced damaged boards, checked the support structure, recorded every repair. When I became old enough, I helped him. Those mornings shaped me more than any classroom ever did. They taught me patience, responsibility, respect. Eventually, I became the person responsible for maintaining the bridge. Every inspection was documented. Every repair was recorded. Every improvement was filed away. Some people called it excessive. I called it professional responsibility, because my grandfather taught me something important. A structure is not protected by good intentions. It is protected by preparation. And that lesson became more important than I ever expected. Because years later, a homeowners association would look at that same bridge and see only an obstacle. They would see old wood. I would see decades of responsibility. They would see something they wanted removed. I would see something they never bothered to understand. Silver Creek Estates did not exist when my grandfather built that crossing. Back then, the land across the creek was farmland. Open fields, old trees, quiet roads. Then everything changed. A development company purchased the property and transformed it into one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the county. They built large homes, stone entrances, perfect landscaping, private walking trails. The advertisements promised a peaceful luxury community surrounded by nature. At first, I welcomed the new neighbors. Most of them were respectful. They understood my family had been there long before their subdivision arrived. I helped one family pull a truck out of the mud after a storm. I loaned equipment during a power outage. I waved at people walking their dogs along the road. There was no conflict. Not until Melissa Bradford became HOA president. Melissa had a unique ability. She could make ordinary preferences sound like official requirements. She talked about standards, appearance, community identity, property values. During her first year, she changed dozens of small things inside Silver Creek Estates. New mailbox rules, approved landscaping colors, restrictions on visible equipment. She believed every detail around the neighborhood should match the image she wanted to create. At first, none of that involved me. My property was outside HOA boundaries. Then she noticed the bridge. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It was polite, almost friendly. It thanked me for being a valued neighboring property owner. Then it suggested that my old red barn affected the visual character of the community. A few weeks later came another letter, this time about equipment near my storage building. Then another. This one mentioned the bridge. Melissa suggested that replacing the old timber structure with a modern design would improve the entrance experience for Silver Creek Estates residents. I read the letter twice. Then I smiled. Because the request was impossible. The bridge was not theirs. It was never theirs. I wrote a respectful response explaining. Asterisk, the bridge was privately owned. Asterisk, my property was outside HOA jurisdiction. Asterisk, the structure was maintained professionally. Asterisk, and I had no plans to replace it. I thought that would end the conversation. It did not. Melissa did not see my response as a boundary. She saw it as resistance. And resistance was something she believed could be overcome. Twa Teep TUC GPV1 Remastered. Full voiceover script, done 2/3. Over the next several months, Melissa Bradford stopped pretending the bridge replacement was a discussion. It became a project. A project she had already decided would happen. The first time I realized things had changed was when I saw survey flags appearing along the creek bank. Small orange markers, placed carefully into the ground. I removed them and put them beside the road. 2 days later, they returned. The second time, there were more. That was when I understood. Melissa was no longer asking for permission. She was preparing for construction. I called the HOA office. Melissa answered herself. Her tone was polite, but there was something different behind it. Confidence. Not the confidence of someone who had a legal answer. The confidence of someone who believed nobody would challenge her. Nathan, she said, I think we need to stop going in circles. I looked out the window toward the bridge. Melissa, there is no circle. There is a simple question. Who authorized the HOA to replace my bridge? She paused. Then she gave me the answer I expected. The board approved the improvement. That was not my question. The bridge benefits the community. That still was not my question. She became quieter. Sometimes individual interests have to consider the greater good. That sentence told me everything. Melissa did not believe she was taking something. She believed she was entitled to it. And that was much more dangerous. Because people who know they are wrong usually hide. People who believe they are right rarely do. A week later, I received another letter. This one was different. It was no longer a suggestion. It was a notice. According to the Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association, the bridge represented an outdated structure that negatively affected the neighborhood's modernization plan. They intended to begin replacement work within 30 days. Unless I provided documentation proving otherwise. I read that sentence several times. They were asking me to prove that something I owned belonged to me. I placed the letter beside the previous ones. Then I opened a folder on my computer. I saved every email, every letter, every photograph, every conversation. I did not know exactly where this was going, but I knew one thing. The moment someone starts changing facts, records become your best defense. 2 weeks later, Silver Creek Estates announced the project publicly. They called it the New Gateway Initiative. The announcement appeared on the neighborhood website. There were digital renderings, professional images, a beautiful stone entrance, decorative lighting, landscape pathways, and replacing the old bridge with what they described as a modern architectural feature. The comments were full of praise. Residents congratulated Melissa. They thanked the board for improving property values. They talked about how much better the entrance would look. Most of them had no idea what was actually happening. They believed the HOA had completed the proper process. They believed someone had checked the paperwork. They believed somebody had verified ownership. Nobody had. That was the part Melissa never understood. Authority is not created because people assume it exists. The equipment arrived before sunrise. I remember the exact morning because the weather was unusually quiet. No wind, no rain, just a cold autumn morning with fog sitting low over the creek. I was drinking coffee when I heard the machinery. At first, I thought someone was working on the road. Then I saw the excavator. My stomach dropped. I drove down immediately. By the time I arrived, the construction crew had already placed barriers around the bridge. Melissa was standing there. Same clipboard, same confident expression, same belief that everything had already been decided. Good morning, Nathan. I looked around. Where is the county permit? She smiled. The project has been approved. By who? The HOA board. That is not a county permit. She looked slightly annoyed. Not worried. Annoyed. As if I was delaying something that belonged to her. Our legal team reviewed everything. I looked toward the contractor. Did you personally verify ownership of the structure you are removing? The contractor looked uncomfortable. He glanced at Melissa. That moment mattered. Because even he understood the question was reasonable. Melissa stepped forward. These discussions have already happened. No, they have not. The contractor lowered his voice. Sir, I am just following the paperwork provided by the client. And there it was. The phrase I would remember later. The client. Not the owner. Not the legal property holder. The client. I pulled out my phone. I started recording. Melissa noticed. She laughed. Go ahead. You will want proof that we improved this place. That sentence would become one of the most important recordings in the entire dispute. I called the county. I explained what was happening. They told me an inspector could review the matter, but they could not instantly stop private construction based only on a property disagreement. I called the sheriff's office. The deputy was professional. He listened. He reviewed my documents. Then he gave me the answer I hoped I would not hear. This appears to be a civil matter. Those 4 words changed everything. Civil matter. A phrase that sounds simple. But when you are standing next to a machine destroying something your family built, it feels completely different. Because the machine does not wait for the court. The machine does not wait for paperwork. The machine keeps moving. And Melissa knew that. She knew the system moved. Slower than construction. The excavator started again. The first section of railing disappeared. Then another. I watched the bridge my grandfather built collapse piece by piece. The workers were quiet. Even they seemed uncomfortable. The bridge was not old enough to be abandoned. It was not unsafe. It was not failing. It was simply inconvenient. And inconvenience was something Melissa wanted removed. By lunchtime, it was gone. 66 years of history. Gone in a few hours. The crew loaded the remaining timber onto trucks. The HOA board members took photographs. Someone posted online. Today we officially begin the future of Silver Creek Estates. I stood beside the creek and watched the water move beneath an empty space that had never been empty before. Then Melissa approached. She carried an envelope. I know this has been difficult, she said. I looked at the envelope. What is it? She smiled. The cost allocation for the improvement project. I opened it. Inside was an invoice. $186,000. Demolition, engineering, construction preparation, administrative costs. And according to the HOA, I was responsible for a portion because my property supposedly benefited from the new entrance. For a few seconds, I honestly did not know what to say. They had removed my bridge. Without permission. Then sent me a bill. Melissa watched my face carefully. She expected anger. She expected shouting. Instead, I folded the invoice, placed it inside my truck, and said, "Thank you for delivering this personally." Her expression changed. Only slightly. But I noticed. She wanted a fight. She wanted emotion. Because emotions are easier to dismiss. Facts are harder. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the invoice. For the first time since the demolition began, I questioned myself. Maybe I had underestimated the HOA. Maybe their attorneys had found something I did not know. Maybe there was some agreement buried somewhere that gave them authority. The worst part was not losing the bridge. The worst part was uncertainty. Because I knew construction. I knew engineering. I knew how to evaluate a structure. But legal authority was different. A bridge could be measured. Ownership could be documented. But power? Power depended on what people believed. And Melissa Bradford had convinced an entire neighborhood to believe something that might not be true. The next morning, I opened the door to my grandfather's old workshop. I had not been inside since before the demolition. I did not know it yet. But somewhere inside that building was the answer Melissa never thought to look for. Twatip TUC GPV1 Remastered. Full voiceover script. Don 3/3. Ket Tuk. I opened my grandfather's workshop the following morning. The building had not changed. The same wooden door. The same old tools. The same smell of pine, machine oil, and paper that had been there since I was a child. Most people would have looked inside and seen an old storage building. I saw decades of responsibility. My grandfather never threw away anything important. He believed records mattered. Every repair, every inspection, every conversation with county officials. Everything had a place. I walked toward the back wall, where several filing cabinets stood covered with years of dust. I opened the first drawer. Maintenance reports. The second, inspection notes. The third, old engineering drawings. For hours, I searched through documents that most people would have considered worthless. But engineers see things differently. A date, a signature, a reference number. One small detail can change the entire story. Then I found something I had never seen before. A folder hidden behind the oldest inspection records. The paper inside was yellowed. The ink was faded. But the documents were still perfectly preserved. The first page was dated 1958. Original bridge construction approval. The second page was a county engineering report. The third document was something that immediately caught my attention. A recorded access agreement. I read it once. Then again. Then I stopped. Because suddenly everything made sense. The bridge was privately owned. My family owned the structure. But the bridge was also part of a legally recorded access corridor created decades before Silver Creek Estates existed. The county had approved the crossing because multiple properties depended on that route. During floods, during emergencies, for utility access, for transportation. Melissa thought she was removing an old private bridge. She was actually removing infrastructure tied to a larger system. And she never checked. I kept reading. The documents connected together. The original construction approval. The maintenance agreements. The emergency access references. The county inspection records. Every piece supported the next. This was not one magic document. It was an entire history. A history that existed long before Melissa Bradford ever became HOA president. Then I found something that surprised me. The original Silver Creek development documents referenced the existing crossing. The subdivision had not replaced the bridge. The subdivision had been built around it. The HOA did not create the access. The HOA inherited a neighborhood that depended on it. I sat quietly in the workshop, not because I was celebrating, because I finally understood why my grandfather had saved everything. He was not collecting memories. He was preserving evidence. The next morning, I did something Melissa never expected. I did not call her. I did not send an angry message. I did not post anything online. I sent documents. That was all. I prepared a complete package. Every photograph, every video, every letter, every inspection report, every agreement. Then I sent them to the people who actually had authority to review them. County engineering, planning department, emergency management, utility services. I asked one simple question. Was the demolition and replacement of this crossing authorized under the recorded agreements attached to this property? I did not accuse anyone. I did not demand punishment. I simply asked for verification. Because facts are stronger when they do not need exaggeration. The first response came that afternoon. A county engineer wanted to inspect the site. The next morning, 2 county vehicles arrived at my property. They walked the creek, measured the remaining foundations, compared the current construction plans with the original records. Nobody shouted. Nobody made accusations. They simply examined the evidence. And that was when I noticed something important. The same people who had ignored my concerns before were now asking different questions. Not, why are you upset? But, who approved this? That was a completely different conversation. Within a week, Silver Creek estates changed. The construction crews stopped arriving. The decorative stone remained stacked beside the road. The entrance sign stayed unfinished. The excitement disappeared. County survey crews returned. Planning officials reviewed documents. Engineers measured the construction area. The same project Melissa had presented as a success had become an investigation. At first, Melissa tried to reassure everyone. She sent emails to homeowners explaining that the county review was simply a routine administrative process. She said delays were normal. She said everything would be resolved. But people noticed something. She stopped talking about the project. She stopped taking photographs. She stopped standing beside the construction site. Because confidence is easy when nobody asks questions. It becomes much harder when people start asking for proof. Then the insurance company became involved. That was the moment the situation changed completely. The HOA's insurer requested documentation. They wanted who owned the bridge, who approved the demolition, who verified the construction, who authorized the replacement. Melissa had answers before. Now she needed evidence. And evidence was exactly what she did not have. The county review meeting happened 6 weeks after the demolition. I expected anger. I expected arguments. Instead, the room was quiet. Around the table sat county engineers, surveyors, planning officials, emergency management representatives, attorneys. Melissa arrived with 2 HOA board members. For the first time since I met her, she did not look like someone in control. She looked like someone waiting for an explanation. The county engineer placed the original documents on the table. Then he placed the new construction records beside them. He looked at Melissa. The issue here is not whether the replacement bridge is better. Melissa immediately responded. It is safer and more modern. The engineer nodded. That may be true. Then he continued. But safety does not replace authorization. The room became silent. Because that was the entire issue. The HOA had focused on what they wanted to build. Nobody had stopped to ask whether they had the right to remove what already existed. The surveyor explained that the original access corridor remained active. The planning department confirmed that Silver Creek Estates had been developed around the existing crossing. Emergency management explained that the route remained important for flood response. Then the attorney representing the HOA spoke. And what he said changed the entire atmosphere. The board had relied on incomplete information. They believed they had authority. But belief was not the same thing as permission. The invoice was discussed next. The $186,000 bill Melissa had handed me after destroying my bridge. The county attorney asked, why was the property owner charged for work he never approved? Nobody answered. Because there was no answer. By the end of the meeting, several decisions were made. The invoice was withdrawn. The HOA accepted responsibility for unauthorized construction costs. The project required additional review before continuing, and an emergency board meeting was scheduled to discuss leadership changes. Melissa walked into that room, believing she was defending her greatest achievement. She walked out knowing it had become the biggest mistake of her career. Almost a year later, I crossed that creek again. The new bridge looked different. It had stronger materials, modern safety features, updated engineering standards. But it carried the same purpose: connecting people, helping neighbors, serving the community. I stood beside the railing one autumn morning and remembered the day the excavator arrived. The day Melissa thought she was removing an old obstacle. The day everyone watching believed she had won. She had been right about one thing. The bridge was old. But old does not mean worthless. Sometimes old means proven. The HOA eventually accepted responsibility for the costs connected to the unauthorized demolition. Melissa resigned before the next election. I never celebrated that, because the lesson was never about defeating one person. The lesson was about what happens when authority becomes more important than responsibility. The new HOA leadership changed their approval process. Every major project involving neighboring properties required ownership verification, legal review, county confirmation. Nobody wanted another mistake like that one. A few months later, a small historical marker was placed near the bridge. It did not mention the conflict. It did not mention Melissa. It simply recognized the families and neighbors who maintained the crossing for generations. That was exactly how it should have been. Because the bridge was never important because of who won. It was important because people depended on it. Before leaving that afternoon, I opened my grandfather's old inspection notebook. The final page contained his last handwritten entry. I added one sentence beneath it: restored, inspected, ready for the next generation. Then I closed the notebook. For years, people believed ownership belonged to whoever had the biggest title, the strongest voice, the most impressive presentation. My grandfather taught me something different. Real ownership is not about control. It is about stewardship. Because wood eventually decays. Steel eventually rusts. Concrete eventually cracks. But the truth has a different kind of strength, especially when someone takes the time to preserve it. And sometimes, the biggest mistake people make is not destroying something they do not own. It is discovering too late that the thing they destroyed was the only thing protecting them.